So I just wanted to do a quick video talking about practice suggestions and some just ideas that I had about practicing so that your ears know as much as your fingers on the guitar. So what do I mean by this? So what I want to think about this in terms of groups of strings, okay? So I'll start off by explaining what I mean on just one string at a time. So if you take this pattern here, so just like a major, scale, the first four notes of a major scale, right? That pattern and the way it sounds is going to be the same on every single individual string, right? So the notes won't be the same, but the interval relationships will be the same, and the amounts of frets in between the played notes, the sounded notes, will be the same. So on the B string, same intervals, same shape, same thing on the G string, and every other string. So that's pretty simple, and for starters, it's highly recommended to practice scales and just single note lines, melodies from songs, whatever, on one string at a time. And being able to do a lot of things on one string is going to help you out a lot. But anyways, moving on, it starts to get a little bit more interesting, and this is where the thoughts that I have start to come in when you are thinking about sets of strings. So let's just bump it up one notch to sets of two strings. So let's look at these top two strings, right? So we've got our B string and we've got our E string. The interval between these is a fourth. Okay? So let's go back to that major scale again, and we'll start from B. First six notes of the major scale in B. That pattern is going to be the same on every other set of two strings that also is tuned to a fourth, so that they're a fourth apart. So how many sets of these strings are there on a guitar? And we're working in E standard, so the concepts still apply, but the intervals will be different for guitars and open tunings and other weird stuff like that. So anyways, we're wondering, asking ourselves, how many other sets of strings are there that are adjacent, like our B and E string, that are also tuned to the interval of a fourth, or are tuned a fourth apart from each other? So we've actually got 3 more sets of these strings tuned a fourth apart. So that would be found between the D and G string. So this pattern we're playing up here, if we play it between the D and the G string, we will be playing and hearing the same interval relationships across those strings. And we can do the same thing from the A string to the D string, because it's also tuned to a fourth. And from the E string to the A string. And hopefully by now you're thinking, okay, I already know that our third and second strings are tuned a major third apart. And that's our G string and our B string. Kind of out of tune. That's okay though. If we play the same pattern, it's going to produce different interval relationships, because these two adjacent strings are tuned to not a fourth, but a major third. So that ends up sounding more like a whole tone scale with this unison here. So why is this important, and why should we think about this and notice this and understand this? Well, the theory that I would put forth, or the suggestion that you can contemplate and try on your own, is that because there are 4 times as many sets of strings tuned to different intervals than this set of strings that's tuned to a major third. Or in other words, there are 4 sets of strings, 2 strings that are adjacent, that are tuned to fourths, and the last set of strings is tuned to a major third. So the patterns that you practice on the 4 sets of fourths, 4 sets of strings tuned a fourth apart, you're going to be playing and hearing much more than the patterns you play and hear across the strings tuned a major third apart. And so, in theory, this might not actually end up being how it is for many people in practice, but in theory that means that you will have to play your patterns. So I would have to play whatever I have to play to make that same 6-note major scale sound on the G string and the B string. I would have to play that 4 more times. So I would have to hear it and feel it and play it 4 more times than I would have to play the same pattern on the other sets of strings. So that's the theory, basically. And you can apply this theory to every other sort of set of strings you can think of. So just to illustrate, let me play this pattern we're talking about again. Now, to get the same sets of intervals starting from this G string and moving up to whatever notes you'd have to play on this B string, and to have a good feeling both under your fingers and in your ear, because the goal here is linking what you're playing here with what you're hearing, so you have a more complete understanding of what's happening on the instrument. You'd have to play that 4 more times. So if, let's say, we play that pattern once on each set of adjacent strings tuned a fourth apart, that would mean that we played that pattern 4 times and heard it in 4 different contexts. To get the same level of familiarity, theoretically, you would have to practice that same pattern, that same interval pattern, on this set of strings tuned a third apart 4 times, just on these 2 strings, right? So that was 4 times with the same interval pattern. Excuse me. So, in that example, playing that pattern of intervals on this set of strings that many times to make up for the extra sort of hearing that you get playing patterns between strings of intervals that are more common. So let's move to the next sort of example. We're still going to work with 2 strings, and now we're going to look at what interval is there between the 3rd string and the 1st string. So from G to E, that's actually a major 6th. Okay, so just mentally note 1 set of strings that produce a major 6th interval. Okay, so now we're going to move down and we're going to take note again. All right, from the 4th to the 2nd string, we're playing a D and we're playing a B. That is also the interval of a major 6th. Okay, so now we've got 2 sets of major 6th string sets. 2 sets of 2 strings that result or that have an interval or are tuned an interval apart of a major 6th. So that's 2 for the major 6th. Now we're going to move down to the 5th and the 3rd string. And we've got our A and we've got a G. That's an interval of a minor 7th. Okay, so this is different now. So we've got 1 set of strings that produces a minor 7th, 2 that produce a major 6th. Okay, so now let's move down to the 6th and the 4th string. the E, and the D, and that is also a minor seventh. So across all 6 strings, for strings that are not adjacent, but that are separated by a string in between them. So the 3rd and 1st, the 4th and 2nd, the 5th and 3rd, and then the 6th and 4th. For those sets, we have 2 sets that result in a minor 7th interval, and 2 sets that result in a major 6th interval. So theoretically, this means that anything you play on the 2 sets of minor 7th intervals would be evened out across the major 6th interval string sets. So you'd only have to play everything on each of those equally. So you don't need to do any compensatory work to make up for hearing things extra times on strings that are tuned to intervals that are more common than other ones. So I just want to do one more, maybe 2 more examples just to get the point across. And I guess you can let me know what you think about all this. This seems kind of, at first it seems like something that's really important that you might not think about immediately, that isn't super obvious. But on second thought, it seems like it might be a bit overkill, and maybe some people just naturally gravitate towards hearing on different sets of strings better. But these are only suggestions and theories. So anyways, so now let's move to sets of 2 strings that are separated by 2 strings. So what are these sets of strings? That is the 4th and the 1st, that is the 5th and the 2nd, and that is the 6th and the 3rd. So for these first 2 sets, between the 4th and the 1st string and the 5th and the 2nd string, those 2 sets of strings are both separated by a major 9th interval. The 3rd set, the 6th and the 3rd string, together as a set of 2 strings, that results in an interval of a minor 3rd. So here we have twice as many sets of strings that result in, or that are separated by, rather, a major 9 interval. And then there are sets of strings that are separated by a minor 10th or a minor 3rd, if you want to think about it that way. But a minor 10th is the true interval. So what does this mean? Hypothetically, this would mean that if you're playing all your patterns across all of these sets of strings, you're going to hear the patterns that work across these major 9th interval separated strings twice as many times as you're going to hear the same patterns or the same interval patterns that you could practice across the 2 strings separated by a minor 10th. So hypothetically, that means you would practice your patterns, like your major scale patterns across these 2 strings, twice as many times. So you would play, major scale patterns or whatever, pentatonic scale patterns, who cares, across the 6th and 3rd string twice as many times to be able to hear it as many times as you play it on the 5th and 2nd string in combination or alongside the 4th and 1st string. So yeah, this is basically like compensating for what you hear a lot already. And oftentimes, I find myself wondering, and I'm sure lots of other people do, and this was something that I always had a lot of trouble with starting out as well, is, that feeling when maybe you're improvising or trying to noodle through something or working through something, of getting to a point where you lose that familiarity and suddenly you don't know what the next note is, where it would be, that kind of like, oh no, what do I do next feeling. And so these theories are kind of coming from thinking about managing or doing something to prevent or work through or get over that kind of occurrence, right? So if you're just as familiar with your patterns on strings that are a fourth apart as you are with the patterns that are on strings that are a third apart, major third apart, then essentially you should be able to hear very well through the whole guitar, seamlessly, in a sense, right? And the same goes for all your other sets of 2 strings. So just to do one more example, let's do sets of 2 strings that are separated by by 3 strings. So you've got your A string and your E string, which results in a 5th, and you've got your E string and your B string, the 6th and the 2nd, which also results in a 5th, or these are a 5th and an octave. But so these are both the same interval. So as many times as you practice patterns on one set of strings, you should practice on the other set of strings. And of course, for the last set of 2 strings, you've got 2 octaves, and there's only one set of these, so any pattern you do on this, you only really need to do as many times as you want. Yeah, so that's the general idea. Basically, keeping track of what you're doing on certain sets of strings, how many times you're doing it, and figuring out how to do it on other sets of strings tuned to different intervals to make sure that you're doing these patterns that you're practicing, or these riffs or whatever, enough times to be able to hear just as well on different sets of strings as any other set of string, especially considering that you will hear patterns across strings tuned certain intervals apart more than others if you don't, do some of this thinking to compensate for that difference. So that's kind of wordy, but that's pretty much the general idea. And I guess I could, draw up some kind of chart and label all this stuff for people who might want that. Leave a comment if you feel like it, and maybe I'll get to that. So thanks for watching.